Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at my steam locomotives. I've been wanting to show off all my locomotives to some capacity, and I haven't really done that, and I especially haven't done that in a long while. And I feel like it might be valuable to give a few words on different pieces and compare sort of what I have, and I guess give some of you guys an idea of where I stand in terms of what I have. Overall, I thought it might be interesting, and if you think this is interesting, then let me know, because I'm going to want to make a video on my diesel locomotives and my electric locomotives sometime. Let's start with the smallest steam locomotive I have, which is an 040 saddle tank engine. This would definitely be the sort of thing to work in industrial railroad, or a dock, or something like that. I forget the number of this locomotive, but it is a sort of later Lionel piece. I would guess 90s, but I know that there are DC variants of this locomotive, and fortunately this was an AC version. It was a while ago that I bought this, but as far as I can remember, it was only like maybe $2. It was either $2 or $5 at a train show. When I got it home, it needed the tiniest bit of work to get running, but I easily got it running and was able to replace the cosmetic components that were missing. It's been through a couple paint schemes, but eventually I settled on just a flat black. I also put crew figures in the windows of the cab here, which I'm pretty happy with, and I think is kind of a fun detail that I really like about this engine. I think it really gives it personality. This version still has an old AC motor that you can get in and work on, which is pretty nice. Overall, I think it's a pretty solid model, and if you can find the AC version of this engine, it'd definitely be worth picking up if you want some small steam power. Another locomotive that has virtually the same mechanism is this 240, and found this for $15, I want to say, maybe a little less, at a train store. Another plastic-bodied steam engine. It performs pretty well considering that. I like the look of it. I think it's rather unique. I think it definitely has a early 20th century look to it, or late 19th century look to it. And the wheel arrangement's something that I don't have a lot of. I gave it a fresh coat of paint and added a headlight to it. It normally doesn't have a functioning headlight. And the mechanism is, as I've said, the same as the previous locomotive, so in that way it's pretty easy to work on. And if you want a 240 for extra cheap, then try to find one of these guys. Here is a Marx 400 locomotive. Not much to say about this one. It looks alright, and it runs good, and it has a headlight. It's pretty bare bones, but you know what, that's something to like. And of course, like all Marx locomotives, it's not too hard to work on. The next locomotive is the Marx Triple. I'm a pretty big fan of this one. I've stated in an earlier video that it is one of the best budget locomotives you could get in terms of quality. And yeah, it has a nice die-cast boiler, all the features that you would expect out of most locomotives, but for a severely marked down price, which is pretty good. This one was found for $20. So yeah, definitely pick one up if you're in the market for a budget steam locomotive. Here is a Lionel 242, which is both the wheel arrangement and the number, and it's pretty typical Scout. It has a plastic body. Yeah, I believe it has a light. Yes, it does. It runs okay, but you cannot work on these mechanisms. I'll talk about that a little more in the next entry. Here's a Lionel 239 steam locomotive. And this is very much the same story as the last one, including the fact that the motor is hard to work on. So if you've ever worked on a Scout or attempted to work on one of these, you can probably predict what I'm going to say about these. And that is, if you can avoid taking apart the motor, definitely do so. Because the plastic casing can sometimes crumble apart when you're working on it. I've had that happen to me, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And, you know, it's almost nearly impossible to get it to actually work once you put it back together. There's always something that's wrong. It is, you know what, it is definitely possible if you're skilled enough, and careful enough, but in some cases you just can't save these. But this unit has had relatively reliable operation. Overall, I don't think I would recommend the Scouts for the most part, but you can find them for incredibly cheap, so the gamble isn't high. Here are two deceased locomotives, as I'd like to call them. A 6110 Lionel and a 1060 Lionel. They both had a similar drive and, well, both died of similar causes. The motor of the 6110 crumbled apart the moment I tried to work on it. When I was running it one time, the locomotive just kind of stopped, and I couldn't get it to move again, so I took it over to the workbench and took it apart. And while I was trying to take the motor apart, it just started crumbling. Like, I wasn't doing anything particularly egregious with it. It just started falling apart in my hands, so... well, I guess this locomotive's fate was sealed. Fortunately, I've been able to use spare parts from it. I hope it wasn't anything too rare. One weird detail that I did notice about this locomotive is it has a hole above the headlight that peeks over to the smoke unit. And this locomotive does have smoke, and it smoked really, really good when it was running. And the continuous burning light from the smoke unit shone through that hole and sort of acted as the headlight so that they could cheap out and not put in a light bulb. So that's kind of a curious thing that makes it kind of a shame that this locomotive ended up falling apart. I'd like to get another Scout chassis to put in this to, you know, sort of resurrect it as a unique, weird piece of Lionel history. But in terms of the 1060 shell, I'm not really in much of a rush to get it running. It was never really a good puller and was always mechanically unreliable. But, you know, I think it looks okay, and I wouldn't exactly mind finding a way to get this shell running. Now we're moving on to some of the bigger locomotives. Here is a Lionel OO that originally came in the Pennsylvania Flyer train set. It's been through a lot of phases in its life, and, well, this was actually the second locomotive I ever got. So part of me wishes that I had left it in as-is condition, but, you know, the earlier locomotives that I had were kind of fodder for my creative impulses, because I, you know, only had a few locomotives for a while. So I think it was kind of inevitable that this happened, although I'm glad that they weren't particularly valuable. But in the end, I'm kind of happy with how this locomotive looks. I think it's definitely in need of a revamp and a major repaint. But overall, I like the generic look of it. I wouldn't change that. Now here's a locomotive that definitely stands out. It's, I would say, probably the only streamliner that I have. It's the New York Central 221 Dreyfuss Hudson. And I think this is a pretty good looking locomotive. Of course, in real life they were never black, but Lionel did make a gray version. Funnily enough, they made more of the gray version than they did the black version. So the black version is technically more rare, but it's less desirable. And you know what? I think this is a great locomotive as well. I think the black looks really good on a Dreyfuss Hudson, and it sort of makes it fit in with the other steam locomotives quite nicely, but it still stands out in its streamlining. Anyways, performance-wise, this locomotive can't really pull that much. It doesn't have magnet traction, and it isn't super heavy, but it does look okay going around the track. I think I got this for $100, which isn't that awful of a deal. At the very least, it looks good sitting on the shelf, and it's a nice addition to the post-war collection. Here's a locomotive that's sort of a recent refurbishment. I don't really have a specific name for this locomotive, although it is a 442. It uses entirely Lionel components, but it's sort of thrown together from a couple engines that have sort of an interesting history. But in the end, it looks like this, and that's all you sort of need to know. It doesn't pull incredibly well, but it looks good, and, well, I'm still a fan of it. Just recently, I painted it in this flat black finish, and I think that looks rather good. This locomotive and tender, until pretty recently, used to be painted in the Girls Train paint scheme, but I brush painted it with acrylic paint because I didn't really intend on leaving it. I just wanted to see how it looked. And I did like how it looked, and I was considering actually stripping off the acrylic paint and getting some pink spray paint and actually making it have a better finish and getting decals and whatever, but in the end I decided that I just wanted another generic locomotive. Yeah, I'm boring. But a Girls Train locomotive, and especially those pastel cars, are definitely not off the table for future purchases. Another recent rebuild is this Lionel 2026. I think this locomotive looks really good. Everything from the body to the wheel arrangement to the tender. And funny thing is, the tender and the locomotive were found in separate places, and I'm not quite sure if this is the tender that actually goes with this engine. But I do think it looks good this way. I recently cleaned all of the components deeply and fitted it back together. It's always had problems with the drive, and unfortunately I don't think that I permanently solved them, because I've probably 2 or 3 times before, every year or so, I take this locomotive apart and work on it because it has some serious issues, and then it works for a little while and I occasionally run it, and then it breaks down again. So I think the only good solution is to find another 2026 motor and put it in this guy. Other than that, everything here is absolutely wonderful. It has all the features, it has smoke, it has a light, and when it does run, it runs pretty good. I think I might have gotten this locomotive for $30, which honestly, for all the components except for the motor, that's not the worst deal. I just need to find a motor that's in pretty good condition to finally have a nice, well-running 2026. The next locomotive is probably my favorite post-war locomotive that I have here, and it's the Penzy Turbine. I mean, it just looks really cool. I think the Penzy has some really nice-looking steam locomotives. Like, along with the duplex, this is just perfect. They always had sort of an interesting design language with their locomotives that was so unique. But this model runs really good, and it can pull quite a bit, and it is incredibly fast. This is the first post-war steam locomotive that I've ever owned, and, well, it was a gift, so that's something to appreciate about it. Overall, if you can find one that's in good shape, even if it's expensive, I'd say it's definitely worth it. But if you could find one that's sort of beat up but has good bones mechanically, definitely get that too, because you could always refurbish it. So here's the biggest steam locomotive that I have, at least I believe it's the biggest steam locomotive that I have. It is a New York Central Hudson. I really like these. I think they're a very attractive steam locomotive. This is an MTH Proto-Sound 1 version, I want to say. I've added directional lighting and marker lights and stuff to it, and I think it looks pretty good. This is a very good smoking locomotive. It pulls well and goes fast. And, of course, it looks great with a 7-car New York Central passenger train. This one was also a gift, except it was from my grandfather. It was more of a gift of circumstance than sort of an intentional gift, but I still appreciate him for it. Overall, it's a nice locomotive, and I, again, definitely recommend it. Next, we have the second biggest steam locomotive I have, which is a Southern Pacific type locomotive. No, not Southern Pacific, but a Southern Railway Pacific type locomotive, a 462. This locomotive just really stands out in the steam crowd because, well, it's bright green. You don't see a ton of steam locomotives that are painted in bright colors, at least in America, or to think of it, pretty much everywhere else except for the UK. But this was the second steam locomotive that I ever got, and, well, it's pretty nice. It's got Lion Chief 2.0 plus? 2.0? I don't know. I wasn't in the loop with the versions of Lion Chief then when I got it, and I still have no freaking clue. But what I do know is this locomotive is really nice, and it's actually made me have quite an appreciation for the Southern Railway. And you know how when you sort of start off buying trains, especially when you're younger, and you sort of go arbitrarily off of what looks cool or sort of what you generally want, not in terms of road name or anything. Well, that was me with this. I didn't really appreciate the Southern Railroad or know where it went or what it did or what the trains' names were. But over time, I've actually come to appreciate the railway, mostly for their green steam locomotives. And of course, the Crescent is an evocative passenger train. So I do like this locomotive quite a lot. The next locomotive is this Marx 040, which has streamlining for some reason. It came with its tender, and, well, when I got it, it was kind of beat up. So eventually I decided on painting it in this paint scheme. Part of me wishes that I had kept it in a black paint scheme, but I do like this livery that I chose quite a bit, and I think it looks okay with the Santa Fe passenger cars that I've inherited from my family. However, this locomotive can't go over Lionel switches due to the single reduction motor. The last locomotive I want to talk about is this 440 American, which I'm a huge fan of. I think it looks really good. Of course, it's based off the General. I mean, it is the General. And it's an interesting historical piece, and I think it adds a little bit of flair and color to the steam locomotive lineup. And honestly, I would say that the color application here is pretty tasteful. Whenever you see, old Western type 440 steam locomotives, they're always in super gaudy colors. And sometimes that is accurate to the prototype and sometimes it isn't. But I think this is both accurate and tasteful. I like the use of darker colors here, and I really think that Lionel did a good job modeling that. It runs pretty good, and it has a headlight, and it smokes okay. You just gotta let it warm up for a bit. The thing is, I don't really own any rolling stock for this engine, except for, well, what I would consider appropriate rolling stock, like a bobber caboose and some generic flat cars. But eventually I'd like to get some period 1800s rolling stock for this guy. And, well, that's all of them. And if you have any thoughts, let me know in the comments. I appreciate the comments quite a bit. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.